program committee member. And I just want to start by saying that I've introduced other people, but I am the most excited about this person. I first discovered him from an op-ed that he wrote in the New York Times. This man's research is absolutely spectacular. Professor Piff received his bachelor's in 2004 from Reed College and his master's and PhD in psychology from UC Berkeley. Currently, he is assistant professor of psychology and social behavior at UCI, where he has established the Morality, Emotion, and Social Hierarchy Lab. Despite his youth, Professor Piff is the author or co-author of more than 25 peer-reviewed articles, several book chapters, 2 patents, and 2 contributions to the New York Times. In 2013, he gave a TED Talk entitled, "Does Money Make You Mean?" Professor Piff has received many honors and awards, including election to Phi Beta Kappa, a prize for his dissertation, and more recently, fellowship in the Society of Experimental Social Psychology. Please join me in welcoming Professor Piff.
I might just hold the mic and walk around, if that's okay with you all. And I'll make this as interactive as I can. And I'm wearing a second mic here because I was told that this is being recorded for posterity's sake. So if I make a joke, or if I make something that sounds like it could be a joke, everyone give it your biggest and heartiest laugh, just so I can seem like a really funny person. Okay, Sue, thank you so much for that. Where did Sue go? Oh, wow, Sue, you're moving, keeping me on my toes. Okay. Well, thank you for that very warm introduction, and of course, thank you for organizing and for reaching out and inviting me to be a part of this wonderful event. So, it's really a treat to be here, and I'm going to talk to you about, let's see, at this point it's been more than a decade's worth of work. A lot of this started at UC Berkeley when I was a young graduate student, and it continues today, and it's taken some different forms. But today's going to be kind of a work or a walk through lots of different kinds of work that we've been doing, looking at how money, wealth, or the lack thereof influences you. How does it change the way that you think about yourself, the way that you make sense of other people, the way that you make sense of the world around you, and most importantly, the way that you behave toward one another. And if you think that money is just a thing that you use to get the things that you want, I'm here to convince you that it might actually change the person that you are and change the things that you think you want. Now, a few weeks ago, a friend of mine sent me a Facebook quiz, and here's how it started. I want you each to think of a vehicle that really appeals to you. This could be a car, a boat, a bike, something you've seen, and imagine or remember finally getting one of your own. And the next day, the very next day, learning that a friend has treated him or herself to the same new toy. How, in all honesty, would you feel? How many of you would feel possibly a little bit annoyed? Okay, wait, is Sue the sole hand up? Wait, there was a hand up there, so Sue, you're not alone. Sue would feel, not to call you out, Sue, but you called yourself out. What? Yeah, okay, more honest. Okay, so very few of you would feel possibly a little annoyed. How many of you would feel flattered because this means you can take them out together? Okay, I will say that a lot of people did not raise their hands. Nonetheless, you might be surprised that how you respond to this question is actually influenced by how much money and how much wealth you have, or at least so claims the quiz that my friend sent to me, which was labeled as a quiz that gets to tell you what your social class is by answering a series of questions about how you feel about gospel music, pedestrian crosswalks, humanity in general. This quiz explores some of the more interesting ways that socioeconomic status shapes Americans' inner and social worlds. Enjoy. I love that last part. Enjoy. Nonetheless, there's some truth to this, and this quiz isn't the first to point this out. F. Scott Fitzgerald, in a short story and in a lot of his work, famously wrote about how the rich and the poor diverge in a whole host of really interesting ways. He famously, in his story, The Rich Boy, talked about how the rich are different from you and me. And there's a lot of work underscoring how rich and poor in society, particularly amidst growing levels of economic inequality, experience a whole slew of important differences in life outcomes, different health outcomes, different likelihood of success in educational settings, different rates of depression and obesity. There are all kinds of different things that emerge as a function of differences in levels of wealth. But what I'm more interested in is how money shapes the social mind. And so one of the early experiments that we ran looked at this in a game of Monopoly. Now, how many of you have played Monopoly around, say, the Thanksgiving table and had it erupt into a big argument? Okay, so many of us are familiar with this game. It's a wonderful game that unites us, that gets us thinking about collective goals. No, it actually pits us against one another in our search for prosperity and maximization of self-interest. And what we did on the UC Berkeley campus was run an experiment in which we looked at how Monopoly might influence the way that people interact with one another. So here's what we did. We brought in pairs of strangers into the lab. These two people did not know one another. We did this for hundreds of different individuals. And with the flip of a coin, we randomly assigned one person to be a rich player and another person to be a poor player in this game. And what that meant was that the rich player got 2 times as much cash to play the game with. They got $2,000 instead of $1,000. The rich player got to roll what we had piloted. So we actually asked thousands of Americans all across the country which of these different game pieces is the most desirable. 95% thought the Rolls Royce is the one that's the high status. Very, very few people thought that the measly shoe piece was a high status piece. So that's what we gave to the poor players. We gave the rich players the Rolls Royce. The rich player got to roll 2 dice instead of 1, so they got to move around the board a lot faster. And when they passed go, they collected 2 times the salary. So they've got more opportunities for success, and every time they go around the board, they're collecting 2 times the salary, in addition to having 2 times the advantage. And all we did in this experiment over the course of 15 minutes was record what happened. So let's take a look. If sound comes through, here are 2 players just getting acquainted with one another and getting acquainted with the game. Oh, wait. That did not. Here, let's try this. It didn't seem to. What if I press display? Play?
How many 500s did you have? Just 1. Are you serious? Yeah. I have 3. I know why they do this so much.
All right. Well, I'll narrate in case you didn't catch that. These are 2 players, one of whom is instantly realizing that he has a lot more $500 bills than the other person. And the only reason I show that clip is because people very quickly realize that one person has far more money than the other. So the advantages or disadvantages in this game are not hidden. It's quickly apparent. And yet, over the course of this game, we noticed really dramatic differences begin to emerge between the different players. Well, so what's happening here, that's going to be tough. It's going to be tough. All right, so what's happening here is just a little representation of a phenomenon and theme that we began to see emerge, which is that, for instance, one of the things that we did was record decibel levels in the room. So we could record how much sound participants were making, for example, as they move their play piece around the board. And if we track the rise in volume, and that video was an attempt to showcase that, rich players began literally smacking the board with their piece, making their presence and their dominance known. They also were far more likely to, in nonverbal ways, celebrate their success. They took up more physical space at the table, so they're more likely in nonverbal ways to take big posture, to take up physical space, to really establish dominance. They were more likely to talk about how well they're doing in the game, more likely to show off and showcase their own victories. Oh. Sorry, I spoke out of turn. Here's a video showing what's happening with a bowl of pretzels that we have positioned off to the corner, and all we're doing is just watching how many pretzels participants reach for in a fairly disinhibited way. So we're just tracking how many of this sort of collective resource rich versus poor players are taking for themselves. And indeed, over the course of the game, people start reaching for pretzels, even those that don't necessarily like pretzels. It's almost like the power of the situation inevitably takes over and just overrides. And as I said, people are in the rich position. We're more likely to brag, talk about how much money they have, talk about how they have money for everything.
You're gonna run out of money soon. You're pretty much untouchable at this point.
So you're seeing that over just the course of 15 minutes, these dynamics begin to crystallize between these two different people, despite there being a clear advantage and disadvantage at the very beginning of the game, such that the rich players almost inevitably begin showcasing how well they're doing, ignoring the plight of the poor players, becoming less compassionate in their behavior, and more likely to try to maximize their own self-interest. And what's most interesting to me is at the very end of the game, when we separated participants into different rooms and asked them a series of questions, including how personally responsible they felt for their own outcome in the game. Remember that rich players got 2 times the advantage. And we'd rigged the game. We played all sorts of different versions, but we had rigged this game specifically because this kind of game would lead the rich player to invariably win. They had 2 times the advantage at the beginning. But when we asked rich players why they had inevitably won, they were far more likely to talk about the things that they'd done and ignore the statistics, but not a single rich player talked about that coin flip that determined their initial position of privilege. And instead, in interviews and in these assessments, they talked about the things that they brought to the table, their skills, their acumen, their own competitiveness, the decisions that they made that got them to that position of privilege at the end of the game. And I think this game is just a simple representation of a basic dynamic that we might observe play out in society, which is that in society, for instance, if you organized it symbolically or thought of society as organized in terms of a hierarchical ladder where some people have a lot more privilege, a lot more power, a lot more resources, a lot more status, and a lot of people don't. Some people have a lot more access to resources and opportunities for success and educational opportunities and good food, and a lot of people don't. And you see that society is stratified in all of these very fundamental ways. And what we've been documenting is that people at the top are actually far more likely to feel like they're entitled to endorse an ideology of self-interest. We can measure this in a whole slew of ways. I'll talk about some of those ways today. Whereas it's the people at the bottom, the people who actually have less, that we find are more compassionate, more empathetic, more generous, more giving, more likely to orient to the needs of others and engage in ways that prioritize others' needs. And that's going to be the work that I'm going to be sort of surveying in my talk today. So let's start with some work that I've done and that others have done on, ignore the text. I'll just tell you what this is all about. The extent to which, as a social psychologist, I'm interested in how people navigate one basic dilemma. And you could say that one fundamental dilemma of social life is how people navigate the struggle between self-interest and other interest. When do you decide to get out of your own head and engage with the needs of someone else? How do you decide when to stop competing and when to start cooperating? How do you decide to turn your attention away from that constant maybe buzzing of me, what I need, my goals, where I need to go, for instance, and engage with what someone else wants, what would serve someone else's interests? And that balance between self and other regard or self and other interest is really a fundamental problem that we've got to solve on a daily basis. So let's look at how social class and levels of wealth might affect this. So we just ran a study, for example, looking at how social class influences people's emotions, the extent to which they experience different kinds of emotions in daily life. Some of these emotions that we measured are things that are all about me. how proud you are, how much pride do you experience in your daily life, how much contentment as a result of your own personal achievements and accomplishments do you experience. We also measured people's levels of compassion. How much compassion do they experience on a daily basis? How much love do they experience for their primary relationships, for the people that they're in relationships with, for their romantic partners, for their siblings, for their children? What we found is this very clear divergence, whereas wealthier individuals, ignore the numbers. The numbers represent things, but I don't need you to decipher them. The wealthier you were, the more likely you were to experience things that are all about you, like pride and contentment, and the less likely you were to experience emotions about others, like compassion and love. Now, elsewhere in our lab, other work has looked at sort of how people relate to the needs of others, even on a biological level. So this is work by Jennifer Steller. All she did was have people watch a video of children who had been diagnosed with cancer and recorded their heart rates. And one of the curious things about the heart rate, or about the heart, is that when people experience compassion, their hearts slow down. Their heart rate decelerates. Why? Well, one idea is that if you're experiencing compassion, one of the first things you need to do is kind of take care of yourself, reduce any anxiety you might feel, calm yourself down before being able to help someone else or calm someone else down. When she showed rich and poor members of the community this video of children diagnosed with cancer, it was poor individuals whose heart rates slowed down way more relative to rich participants. And then Pia, my wife here, recently ran a study. It's an incredibly interesting study just a couple of years ago, or maybe a year ago actually, where what she did was hook people up with observational devices like eye tracking, or in one study, Google Glass, and just measured patterns of attention among rich and poor members of the community or undergraduates, college students. And what she found in the study was that richer participants were far less likely to spend time looking at, to direct attention to people that they encountered in all of these different, for instance, city scenes or when walking down the street relative to poorer people. So on a very basic level, even when looking at patterns of visual attention, how people orient the gaze, what people are attending to in their basic environments when they're trying to figure out what's worthwhile interacting with or what's not worthwhile interacting with. It's the poor individuals that attend to others and rich people who seem to ignore others on a very basic level that they encounter in their social worlds. Now, what about deservingness? I mentioned this, patterns of entitlement, the extent to which someone feels deserving of something relative to someone else. So we've done a lot of different work looking at this. Here's one way of measuring entitlement, where we ask people to just select pairs of circles to represent how they see themselves relative to other people. So, for example, on the left-hand side, you see me, and then those three circles representing others, that's the O. And we give people different sets of circles that have the size of the me circle increase in size, such that by the end, the one you could choose has that huge circle representing me that's 4 times the size of the other circles. So we just ask people to select which set of circles best represents how you see yourself in relation to other people. Richer people are far more likely to select sets of circles that represent themselves as far larger, perhaps more important than others around them. You can ask people questions like the psychological entitlement scale. My favorite item on this scale, this is a validated scale, but if I were on the Titanic, I would deserve to be on the first lifeboat. How much do you agree with that statement? And in fact, there was a fascinating article in the New Yorker that did an archival and historical analysis of who it is that survived the Titanic. And actually, it was rich white men on the Titanic that were anywhere from 4 to 5 times more likely to survive than women and children. So there is some truth to this statement. Nonetheless, when you ask people levels of agreement across the income spectrum, you see rates of agreement with the psychological entitlement scale, or scores, go up at this linear rate. The more money you have, the more deserving of things you feel relative to others. We can ask people, we can also look at narcissism, which includes entitlement, but includes other things like grandiosity, omnipotence, the sense that you're infallible and all-knowing. This is the narcissistic personality inventory, like, I have a natural talent for influencing people, or I'm not good at influencing people. And we ask people to select which of the two they like. I prefer to blend in with the crowd versus I like to be the center of attention. The wealthier you are, the more likely you are to score high on this narcissistic personality inventory. Now, let me just tune you into this one item here. I like to look at myself in the mirror versus I'm not particularly interested in looking at myself in the mirror. Love that item. That item reflects vanity, right? A preoccupation with your physical appearance. So we went ahead and measured vanity. What we did was run a study where, unbeknownst to participants, we secretly observed whether, as they made their way from the lab to another part of the lab down the hall, they encountered a mirror that we had positioned in the hallway. And now this is just a kind of a visual demonstration. Our confederate or our researcher was not as visible. We were using sort of one-way mirrors to observe this. But we just recorded and observed without them knowing whether participants, as they walked by, took advantage of this great opportunity to stare at their reflections in the mirror and maybe groomed themselves and made sure that they were nicely preened in preparation for the second part of the study. And indeed, the wealthier you were, the more likely you were to stop and stare at your reflection. Okay, so far we've seen perhaps that wealthier individuals are more likely to, or less likely I should say, to attend to others. They experience less compassion. Even on the level of attention, they direct less attention to other people. They feel more entitled than others. Now, what about how that relates to behavior? Now, I mentioned that perhaps it's the case that the less you have, the more giving you are. And we've done some studies to test this. So we've looked at self-interest in a very broad way. One of the ways is by looking at patterns of generosity. Now remember, I'm a social psychologist, and one of the things that I do is run studies, as you've seen, to look at patterns of behavior. One of the studies that we ran includes a very simple task that we call the dictator task. I know it sounded like I was saying dictator, as if it was two different words. I didn't mean to do that, but dictator. It's called the dictator task because our participant is acting as if he or she was a dictator in this game. And what that means is they decide, we gave them the equivalent of $10. We say they can keep these $10. But if they want, they can share a portion of those $10 with someone else that they've been paired with in the study who got no money. That's it. They'll never meet the other person will never meet them. Those $10 are theirs to keep, but if they want, they can share some of them with the other person. Make sense? Yeah.
Did they have the money in their hand?
The question is, did they have the money in their hand? Yes. Oh, I had some water there, but I don't have it anymore. Oh, behind the podium. Let me grab it. I can do it. No need to get up, Barbara. Thank you.
He must not be rich.
Yeah. It's just an act. I actually make a huge salary as a public university employee. No, I'm kidding. They're under. Who said they're underpaid? All right, whoever you are my dear friend. Yeah, they're overpaid? Oh, they're overpaid. How right you are, my friend. Okay. So we just measure how much money participants give away to this other person, a perfect stranger, and what we find is that people who have less are more giving. The rich participants in our study gave far fewer of their dollars away. In fact, people making $150,000 or $200,000 or more a year gave approximately half as much as did individuals in this study making $15,000 or less. So a striking contrast.
In absolute dollars or percentage terms?
Absolute dollars. Now, in studies of charitable giving, do I have that slide up? Yeah, this is in percentage. So for example, in looking at those trends, you might look to national trends to see if you find any parallels, and in studies of household giving, you often find what's called a charitable giving divide, wherein households making between, say, $50,000 and $75,000 give This is proportional giving to Jonathan's question. Jonathan or John? Either one?
Whatever.
Okay. Okay, Johnny. No, I'm kidding. Give on average proportionately 2 times as much of their salaries, their household income to charity as do households making $100,000 or more. And you see this pattern bear out in different contexts. Now, if I take a question, I've got to repeat it because I was specifically asked to save questions for the end. But since you did raise your hand, ever so kindly.
So actual amount of money could be really same. So that is how they look at it. They don't look at it as percentage.
Yeah, so there's actually, well, okay. So what is psychologically more, you're asking whether the right thing to be looking at here is absolute numbers instead of proportions. Is that right?
They think that way.
How do we know they think that
The
way?
People, from my talks, I have.
Okay, oh, interesting. Okay, that may be the case. That may be the case.
Because 50,000, 100,000, see that at 4.2, double it, 8.4, see?
Well, maybe we save that point. Yeah, yeah. We'll save that point, and I think it could be an important point
That's okay, that's okay.
for the end. But thank you for the comment. No problem at all. All right, so at least some suggestive evidence, though you could question these data for various reasons. Like, for example, you could say this is proportional giving. But in terms of absolute numbers, yes, it's the case that households with more incomes give more. In absolute numbers, right? Now, which is more psychologically meaningful, right? If you have $5 in your pocket or to your name and you give $1 away, compared to someone who's got $1 million and gives $1,000 away, who's more generous? Now, someone could say, the person that gave $1,000 away gave more money away. But there's psychological reason to say that the person who gave 20% of what they've got is more generous. Now, I'm not going to stake a claim, but I have a sense that people would, in general, deem one kind of behavior more generous than the other. We've done other studies looking at patterns of helping. So beyond money, who gives up time? For those of you thinking about whether it is the time, what's more psychologically meaningful, time or money, there's actually a whole bunch of new research that says if you want to get bang for your buck, spend money on getting yourself time. Having more time is a lot better for your well-being, your levels of happiness, than having more money. So time is a hugely relevant variable for people's well-being. We looked at how much people would be willing to give up their own time to help someone else. In this study, what we did was randomly assign people to one of 2 conditions, where they spent either something like a minute watching just a video about nothing in importance, or they watched a video that we'd designed to make people feel heightened levels of compassion. So for a minute, they watched a video of children all over the world suffering from poverty and hunger, that we had piloted to show that this video makes people feel higher levels of compassion in the here and now. Then about 20 to 30 minutes later, they were sitting in the lab, and into the lab, as they're completing questionnaires, bursts an individual who is visibly distressed, visibly worried, and apologizes for being late. Now, that was an actor that we had hired and trained to appear worried and to show up late, but it gave us an opportunity to measure one particular thing. Because when that actor, who the other person thinks is their partner in the study, seats themselves in another room, our experimenter then turned to our participant and said, that was your partner in the study, who, as you see, was very, very late. And look at this list of things that they need to do. And they show them a list of all of these different tasks. And the experimenter asked the participant, would you be willing to take on a certain number of these extra tasks, give up your own time to help out this other person who would otherwise need to stay on for an extra 74 minutes to complete all of these different tasks required of him or her. And that's how we measured helping in the lab. How many tasks our participants signed up for that they didn't need to help this other person out. That's it. We're just trying to find a way to quantify helping behavior in a situation. What we found, people with more money in our neutral condition, that is when they didn't watch a video that made them feel more compassion, you see the same differences. They gave up fewer minutes of their own time, that's richer people here, relative to people from the community who were poorer. Poorer people were more generous with their own time. They took on more tasks. They gave up more minutes to help this other person out. But when we had people watch that compassion video, it's in that condition that I think a really important point is made. We see those differences disappear. What that means is that wealthier individuals, when they were reminded of the needs of others, when we cracked through what you could call the veil of insularity or self-focus that wealth otherwise affords you, and reminded them temporarily of the needs of others in the world around them, that made them just as compassionate, just as giving, just as helping, just as willing to give up their own time for another person that they'd never meet, but that was in need of their help as everyone else. So, are these differences fixed, unchangeable, rooted in character? No. These differences between rich and poor are highly sensitive to different kinds of interventions, different kinds of little nudges, little bumps of empathy. And I think that's a really important point that I think would be worth thinking about and even talking about after I've worked through some more studies. Beyond generosity, we've looked at cheating and ethical behavior. Who's more likely to lie, to cheat, to steal in all sorts of different contexts? You probably know where this is going. We had people in one study play a simple game where we gave them opportunities to win a $50 cash prize. The rules of this game, we told them, were fairly simple. The computer, it was like a gambling game of chance. The computer, we told participants, was going to roll a die for them 5 times. And we asked participants to keep track of their score across these 5 rolls and report their total at the end. So the higher your score, the better your chances would be of winning this cash prize. Now, if someone got perfect, let's make sure you're listening. If someone got a perfect score across all 5 rolls, what's their max score in this game? 195. Good guess. How many sides on a die? 6. What's the maximal score on one roll? 6. So if you've gotten perfect 6s across 5 rolls, you've got a maximum score of 30. Okay. So that's the maximal score, but unbeknownst to participants, what we've done is actually rig the game. Everyone gets a measly score of 12. First a 3, then a 1, then a 2, then a 2, then a 4. Now we know, by virtue of giving people the opportunity to report their score to us, that any score different from 12 is cheating. Now you might ask, did anyone report getting a perfect day? Getting a perfect score? Indeed, wait, let me not get there. We had 5 people report perfect scores. Those very 5 people were at the very top of our income brackets. We also had people complete a measure, a standard measure of attitudes toward greed. I didn't invent this. This is something that's used to measure how the extent to which people moralize, view in a favorable light, think that it's a good thing to do to be greedy as opposed to being other-oriented and considerate of others. For example, we ask people to rate their levels of agreement with something like, it is not morally bad to think first of one's own benefit and not other people's. Okay, so what I'm about to show you is what's called a mediational diagram. But don't be offended by that term. I'll explain what this looks like. We look at the relationships between money or social class and cheating, and what we found is that the wealthier you were, the more likely you were to cheat, the more likely you were to report impossible scores higher than 12. Okay, so far so good, or so far so bad, I should say. Wealthier people were also more likely to moralize greed. They reported higher scores. They exhibited higher scores on this moralization of greed inventory. And all this analysis shows is that richer people in this study cheated more because they moralize greed beyond helping and being ethical and being moral, which is to say that there is an ideology of self-interest perhaps that persists among those that have, that overrides other ethical, normative, or moral concerns. That's not to say that other ethical or moral concerns aren't of concern, but that there are other sometimes competing values, for instance, being competitive and maximizing self-interest, that may sometimes cause someone to override those other moral values. For example, here, of whether or not it's right to cheat in a game. After all, it's a game, it's an experiment. Who cares, really, right? It's not a big deal, you could say to yourself. You could justify it. You could say, why wouldn't I take advantage of this stupid opportunity to cheat? Didn't the researchers know that I'd be able to cheat in this? This is hilarious, right? Justify it to yourself and do it. Easy to justify. Nonetheless, who is it that justifies it? If that is in case what they're doing, it's those that have more relative to those that don't. All right. So, some of you are probably asking this. I'll take this off the screen for just a second. If it's the case, how are we doing for time? Sue, what time is it?
10 of 8.
10 minutes, 15.
10, 15 minutes. How are we doing? Are we feeling okay? Do we want to do any coordinated stretches, some deep breathing exercises just to, no? No, we don't. Okay. All right, let's not do that. All right, so some of you are probably wondering to yourself, so far I've just shown that wealthier people might be less generous than poorer people, right? And you could say, well, maybe it's the case that someone who's really generous doesn't do as much to collect wealth. So it's not wealth that causes people to be more or less generous. It's people that are more or less generous that become more or less wealthy, right? So this is a question of correlation versus causal. Is it wealth that's making people behave in one way or another? Or is it just the case that people who behave in one way or another become more or less wealthy over the course of their lives? So we've run studies, like that Monopoly study, where we manipulate people's sense of being rich or being poor. One simple way of doing that is we get people to think of themselves, right here, in relation to someone who's richer than they are, and we ask them to write about what that feels like. And by doing that, we make someone feel relatively less well off. So all we're doing is getting someone to engage in a relative comparison. We can all be made to think of someone who has more than we do, and by virtue of that one social comparison, you make someone feel, less well off for just a moment. Or we can get someone to think of themselves in relation to someone who's got less than they do, and they could be made to feel, psychologically speaking, better off. Make sense? All right. So all we do in these different experiments is have people do this. People who are actually rich or poor, we're making them feel temporarily relatively more poor or relatively more rich than someone else. In this one study, we have people do that task, then we have them complete a standard measure of unethical decision making, where we get them to read these different scenarios that describe someone doing something unethical, like buying a coffee and a muffin and paying for it with $10, but instead of getting change for 10, they get change for 20. And they decide to keep that extra change even though that money is not theirs. There's another scenario that describes colluding with someone else to accept a bribe from a customer. Another scenario that describes taking food that's not yours from a restaurant that you work at. And we just ask people, how likely would you be to engage in these different behaviors? After people completed this and a bunch of other tasks, they were prompted by the computer to exit the lab and enter the hallway, where they are greeted by an experimenter who is holding a jar of candy. And this jar of candy was labeled as being reserved for children participating in studies in a developmental lab nearby. So participants fully know that this jar of candy is for children, but they have the option to take some. And we record how much of this candy participants take. So, turning to our findings, here with our measure of unethical decision making, remember these are people made to feel poor or made to feel rich, irrespective of how much wealth they actually have. People who felt rich made more unethical decisions, or they endorsed behaving more unethically than people who felt poor, and when it came to taking candy, they took 2 times as much. From kids! No. From children, from the hands of babies, is what one headline that reported on these studies suggested. We did not have babies in the study, and it's not the case that rich people were actually prying babies' hands open to take the cherry Jolly Rancher. Nonetheless, some experimental evidence that even feeling, relatively speaking, better off than someone else can trigger these self-interested patterns of behavior. Now, beyond the walls of our lab, we've done these, what I call naturalistic studies, where we look at patterns of everyday ethical or unethical conduct. And what better way to look at unethical conduct than on the road, right? For those of you that drive or have driven, as many of us have, you've seen that sometimes people don't obey the laws. So I remember one day as I was thinking about this work, crossing the street or trying to, after car after car after car drove through the crosswalk without stopping. And in California Vehicle Code, it's the law if you're stopping, that you if someone has stopped at a crosswalk and you're driving, that you stop and yield the right of way to the pedestrian. We all do that. I know we do. But what I wanted to do was look at whether drivers of different kinds of vehicles, which was the way in this study that I got to look at levels of wealth, would be more or less likely to obey the law. So we had experimental coders hiding behind, literally, bushes, watching cars as they come down the roadway, recording the Kelley Blue Book value of the car, and then critically whether the driver of that car gave the right of way to a pedestrian that we had posed. So this is someone in our study that we have walk up to the crosswalk and stop at exactly the same time for hundreds of different cars, and stop, look at the driver, make sure that there's eye contact, and then we record whether or not the driver of the car stops. So here's what that looks like. There's our pedestrian walking up to the crosswalk on over there to the left and stopping as the driver of the red truck successfully stops. Now, in typical Berkeley fashion, the bus just picks it up and almost runs our pedestrian over. Now, here's a Prius driver driving right through, and here's a BMW driver just blazing through and doing the same. So we did this repeatedly for hundreds of different vehicles on several consecutive days, and what we found was, you know where this is going, the more expensive the car you drove was, the less likely you were to stop, the more likely you were to cut our pedestrian off. There is a clear linear trend. Now, lest you think this is Northern California, Southern California is not the same. Here's UC San Diego's Jeremy Boyd, who sent me, these are data from more than 1,000 different vehicles at more than 50 different intersections all over Southern California, including in Irvine and, believe it or not, Laguna, documenting the very same trends. And Beth Morling, who's a social psychologist in Delaware, with her students, ran a study at crosswalks there. So at least in 3 locations, some tentative, don't fully conclude, but some suggestive evidence that perhaps the levels of wealth that you have might influence or might be associated with different patterns of subtle behavior on the road. Don't know, but suggestive. At the time that I was running this work, remember, for some of it I was at Berkeley, and Berkeley is a left-leaning institution, as some of you know. And I wondered whether that kind of bias, whoop, I lost the mic, no. Okay, sorry. I wondered whether that bias had kind of crept its way into my research. Is it just me because of the saturated liberalness of these walls that I occupy as I'm doing my work has crept its way into my own work? And am I just documenting these things and no one else is finding these same trends? So I went out into the literature. And I looked for other people that have looked and found or documented similar kinds of trends buried in their results tables. So, when you look at shoplifting rates, this is an epidemiological study of more than 250,000 adults all across this country, a representative sample. Who is it that has shoplifted? Stereotypes would say one thing. It's the people who are poor. And yet, incidents of shoplifting are about 3 times higher among more educated, wealthier individuals. Who is it that's more likely to commit tax fraud? There was actually a new study that looked at 1.7 million Americans and tax fraud. It's wealthier individuals. Now, if you think that's just limited to cheating on taxes, no. Wealthier individuals are actually also more likely to cheat on their romantic partners. They're more likely to commit unlawful acts of discrimination. They're more likely to justify those unethical acts, and like things like sexual harassment in the workplace. And this is a really interesting study by Wang and Keith Murnaghan at Northwestern, but what they did across more than 72 different countries is look at whether or not you endorse unethical behavior as a function of wealth, things like not paying for public transportation if you had to use it, or accepting bribes, and across lots and 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 lots of people in lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of different countries, you see the same kinds of trends. So not just North America, maybe it varies a little bit, but there does seem to be this specific but robust association. All right, so to summarize, we're finding that to an extent, wealth seems to be related to an increased sense of entitlement, increased tendencies to behave in self-interested ways, increased tendencies to behave in unethical or perhaps immoral ways, whereas poverty or relative disadvantage seems to be related to increased compassion, generosity, and cooperation. What our work is suggesting is that wealth, beyond just determining the important outcomes of people's lives, is also a social phenomenon. One of the points that I like to make is that in this country, there's a narrative that pathologizes poverty. Pia and I were just talking about this, I think, a couple of days ago. But that's a common narrative, right? Poverty is a disease. Occupying impoverished neighborhoods seeps underneath the skin. We think of poverty as something that's really negative, and that is true. But what that does is dehumanize those that experience it as hapless victims of their circumstances, right? As the mere recipients of the negative circumstances that they're put in. And what this work would suggest is that everyone devises coping mechanisms or tries to override the chaotic and threatening environments they're put in, and that poor people perhaps do that. One way in which they do that is by engaging with their social relationships, by engaging with others, by building networks of mutual and reciprocal aid that they can rely on in times of need, because it's those networks that determine how well they can do when times get tough. And broadly, that there might be some downsides to wealth and privilege. Money may not be some kind of unmitigated good, such that the more of it you have, the better off you are. In studies of millionaires, for example, people frequently talk about how in the accrual of wealth, they lost track of their friends, and now they're not as trusting of others. They feel more cynical of their relationships. They occupy these kind of social islands. So perhaps there are some costs to wealth and privilege that get you to disengage from others, from your community, and prioritize self-interest above the interests of other people. So, Sue, how are we doing for time? I can end there. Let's end there. Let's just go with questions, because I know there are at least 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 questions. Thank you all. Why don't you wait until can I walk around and give people the mic? Yeah?
Remember, keep your questions short. Questions short, so if you're...
What is your influence, what have you taken account of a social influence in the family in relation to that person also getting a turnaround in college or in education? Those two things, home and the education.
So have I taken that into account in my, so the question, if I may paraphrase, is how have I taken into account family background versus educational experience in accounting for these effects? Is that at all right? Okay, so I think family background is part of this. Where, in what ways, so for instance, if we're looking at college students, right, and running some of these studies. Now, college students have not earned their own money, right? They're coming from families of wealth or families that have less wealth. Not necessarily. How so?
Wait, we need the microphone.
Okay, so let's save that double back question. All I mean is that different students in college environments have different backgrounds, different familial backgrounds. And I think to the extent that different college students behave in different ways or have different values, some of that comes from socialization. And an important part of how college students are socialized are their family values. So not my work, but there's a lot of ethnographic and sociological work that looks at how Individuals from different families with different levels of wealth are socialized in different ways. So for instance, Lamont is a sociologist that spent some time in different households with different levels of wealth. And one of the things that she talks about in the paper is how kids from families with money are asked to set themselves apart from others, to find out what's special about them, to express their individual selves. Whereas individuals from less well-off, less advantaged backgrounds are really sort of inculcated to believe in the values of fitting in, of going along with the norms. This microphone keeps turning up, so I want to keep distancing it from my face for some reason. But socialization is a big part of, I think, a lot of the patterns that I'm documenting here.
My question is for the wealthy, well, both groups really. Have you ever did any religion background? See what their religious beliefs are.
Among the wealthy versus those that don't.
Especially
That sound is kind of annoying, am I right? Okay. So that's not it. I'll use the other mic.
Yeah, I'll wheel this one around.
Just tell me what you'd like me to do. Yeah, okay. I'll do this. Perfect. All right, how's this? So two things. In all the studies that I just talked about, we look at the effects of money while also holding, we also measure religion. We didn't mention it. What I'm doing in these studies is controlling for it, and what that means is taking it out of the analysis. But I can also tell you, because we measure them, how religion affects generosity, how religion affects compassion. I could tell you how sex or gender affects compassion. I could tell you how politics affects generosity and compassion, because we've measured all those things. I don't talk about them because sometimes that takes away from the main point of this talk, but I'm happy to open up about them if you'd like me to. Did that make sense? So religion, people who are more religious tend to be more generous. They tend to be more compassionate. Yeah. Now, take that with a grain of salt, because it's not always the case. But in these studies, that's typically what I find. Now, we also measure political differences. So left versus right leaning. What's your guess? Okay, I'll leave it there. Next question.
I have Mike, I think. Since Vasti asked the question, I was mainly interested about religion, but you did allude to the fact that you can work on these things to change behavior. Yeah. So maybe talk a little bit about that. And then you have these advocates out there that always say it's not a bad thing to be rich. So how do you,
it's not a bad thing to be rich.
I know, they will insist that it's not bad to be rich. So what makes them not realize that it does change their way of dealing with people and situations?
Okay, so there are two questions there. Okay, so the first one is, what are the kinds of interventions that we've tested out or that we could scale out? So as a social psychologist, I'm doing a lot of work in the lab. We've done some things that test broader scale interventions. But the lab work, what that does is give us some basic insight into what kinds of things you might be able to do on a broader level. So, for example, in that study that I talked about where we had people watch that 46-second long video, I don't think the conclusion of that study, if you wanted to, say, advocate for changes in policy, would be that we should get everyone to watch 46-second long videos for the rest of their lives. What that study does is just make a simple point. If you get people to get outside of themselves and reorient their attention away from themselves to the needs of others around them, then that might be effective in bumping up levels of empathy and levels of other regard and levels of cooperation and maximizing or engaging with the needs of the collective. So how do you do that? Okay, there are a lot of different ways. So for instance, when I talk about some of this work and someone who at a speaking event, a speaking engagement a few months ago, someone who works for a nonprofit said, oh, that's so interesting because we, for the last 50 years, have been taking donors who are relatively wealthy and putting them on buses and driving them through more impoverished parts of their community that they would otherwise never be privy to. Why do they do that? They're doing it to expose them momentarily or in fleeting fashion to parts of their community that are otherwise invisible to them, to get them to take some perspective. Okay? Another thing I would say is one thing that wealth buys you is space. Space from other people. And Pia and I have talked a lot about this. Wealth, why do people want money? Well, one of the things that money affords you is more space. Think about it. First class tickets. What's good about first class tickets? What do you do when I ask people, if you had money, what would you do with it? And you have to spend it on yourself. You could spend it on other people. Oh, I would buy myself a bigger house. Bigger house. A bigger car, right? What kinds of jobs do wealthier individuals have? They have jobs where they're more likely to work far away from others, giving people instructions, less likely to work as members of teams. When you live in neighborhoods that are wealthier, you have more space between your house and the house beside you, bigger yards. The rooms in your home are further away from each other. So this isn't my point. This is the sociologist Irving Goffman that noticed that with all kinds of status comes an increase in social space. So if that's the case, then if you break through that space, you might be able to restore levels of empathy. So for example, there was a study that looked at whether richer individuals in communities that expose them by virtue of the nature of those communities to people who are diverse racially or socioeconomically, what are levels of compassion and levels of charitable giving among individuals in those neighborhoods as opposed to rich individuals that live in neighborhoods that are more insular, that are less socioeconomically diverse, that are just, you and similarly rich people. And whereas people in similarly rich neighborhoods do not exhibit reduced levels of compassion, it's those rich individuals who are on a regular day level exposed to the needs of diverse others that you see levels of compassion that equal the highest or most compassionate people in society. So I think that makes an important point. Get outside, talk to someone else, learn to take someone else's perspective, engage with the needs of others, learn that you share a common humanity. These are all truisms, and I think you can practice them in all sorts of ways. So interventions that, for instance, get people to do that, to go outside of their routinized comfort zones and for a moment share a story or get a story from someone else and connect with someone who's different from them, not once, but doing it in a sustained way. And you could do this with apps, you could do this with, I'm going to do this more. You could do this in all sorts of different ways, but things like that on a very basic level could go a long way. All right. Question there.
Professor.
Not me.
In your sampling study here, have you done any ethnic composition? Is that composition all races included?
Yes.
Or have a plan to study on black and white composition or Asians?
Yeah, so these are all, for instance, we have representative samples that represent the broad distribution of the United States. Many of these samples are fairly ethnically diverse or racially diverse with respect to racial breakdowns across this country or that are representative of a particular community. So we're controlling for race in these analyses, but I can also tell you how different ethnicities across these different outcomes that we look at behave differently, that is a trend that we can look at.
Are there particulars between ethnic groups?
Are there differences? I keep stepping on this. So one of the analyses that we do is, so if you think about power and status in broad terms, the more money you have, the more power you have relative to someone who has less power, right? There we find more powerful, right? More money, less compassionate. So if you broaden that out and apply that to all sorts of other contexts, you find similar differences. So who in this country has more power? People who are white or people who are non-white? Okay, so if it's the case that white people have more or experience more sense of power, then you should expect that they should be less compassionate, less likely to behave in ethical ways. And when compared to other ethnicities, that's exactly what we find. When you look at sex differences, who has more power in the society, men or women? Okay. So when you look at outcomes as a function of sex, you find the same kinds of things. It's women, I'm talking small effects here, right? These aren't huge differences. They're just statistically significant ones. Nonetheless, females in the study are more likely to exhibit increased compassion, to behave in ethical ways, to be more generous relative to males. I think those are trends that you see as a function of experienced power, however it's experienced. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, I have the talking stick over here. A couple of examples that seem the extreme, and talking about people that supposedly have wealth. One has an orange face, and the other one are Bill and Melinda Gates,
Yeah.
who seem to have extreme wealth and do very differently.
Right.
How do you account for that sort of difference?
I don't know anyone who has an orange face, first of all. I want to do my best. I wish I had good impressions that I could roll out now as I said that. Yeah. Whoa. Okay. Okay. So what you're asking, it's a great question. It's hard to know why one person is different from another specific other person, because I look at populations of people. But for instance, if you, as others have, dig into why, for instance, Bill Gates has the proclivities, you might say, empathic tendencies that he has. Why, for instance, he's directed much of his life to, you could say, serving the needs of the world, right? Or trying to better the world, using his wealth for good. There are experiences he's had, for instance, while at Harvard, learning and experiencing poverty in Africa that he talks about as having been foundational in the transformation of his values, right? There might be differences in upbringing. For instance, Warren Buffett comes from a fairly disadvantaged background, right? So you can look at not only socialization as one of the questions brought up, but also what are the kinds of experiences you've had at critical phases of your development that have gotten you to kind of think about the values that you have and the values that you want to have and the values that you believe others should have and that will make the world a better place. And there are some that have had those experiences and others that haven't, right? There's also like a very broad answer, which is, where does your advantage come from? Did you work for it or did you inherit it? Did you get it? Yeah, I'm getting a lot of nods of agreement. So you guys like that answer. Yes, it is like the Monopoly game, right? But where your privilege, where your power comes from in the first place is going to have important implications for how you experience it. Yeah.
I first went to China in 1988. At that time, no one had anything. It was an amazingly poor country. And I've been there many times since then. The friends that I made there who had nothing have become very wealthy. And what I've noticed over these years is that they are less generous. Before they had nothing, but they seemed very generous. Now that they really have big money that they never thought they would have, they are not generous like they used to be or seem to be. Have there been studies that have specifically studied China because it has done something in a relatively short space of time that's really quite amazing for a whole society?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Not that I know of. It's a wonderful question. Would be an incredible study to have run. I know of work, so I'm collaborating with someone in Qatar, which is a Middle Eastern country that has experienced inordinate economic growth because of the influx of foreign business and the rise of oil, right? So they've got tremendous resources, and people practically overnight, or in the grand scheme of things, you might think of it as in a split second, became all across the country incredibly wealthy. And there's been a precipitous drop in national levels of happiness that people are worried about. Why? When a country becomes super wealthy, would it experience a precipitous drop in indices of happiness and social trust? But there is also an opportunity there for me and my collaborator to look at pre and post differences in social values. So stay tuned. There is one study that came out of the UK, the London School of Economics, that looked at lottery winners and shifts in their political preferences. And so whereas when people didn't hadn't yet won the lottery, hadn't yet encountered some windfall rise in their levels of wealth. They were more likely to endorse sort of helping the poor and redistribution of wealth and find inequality problematic, perhaps not surprisingly, but as soon as they had more of that thing that they didn't have much of, money, their values totally shifted. So there's reason to think that you're onto something, or that we both are. Question over there. Question over there.
Yes, when I began in this world, most of the people were living in communities in structured housing areas, 40 years period of living in a I can't think of the name of it right now, but anyway, in the last 40, people have been living in these gated communities versus the open communities. Have you seen that showing up in any of your statistics?
That's a good question.
I'm not sure could we actually have you ask the question again? Have I seen people living in two different kinds of communities, and I lost track of which those two might be? Gated. Oh, gated communities. Are people living in more gated communities now? What?
The question was about the difference in, have you noticed any difference in behavior now that more people live within gated communities opposed to like open subdivisions?
I haven't done the gated community study, but I've always wanted to. Because remember that point that I was making about money buys you space? Right? Think about the tendency to want to live in a gated community and where that comes from. Well, maybe you want to live with like-minded others. Maybe you don't feel safe and you feel safer behind closed walls. And there are all sorts of justifiable reasons. But one of the things that a gated community does is gate you outside of, create a boundary between yourself and others. And if that kind of geographic distance and separation does not translate into psychological distance and separation, then I would be tremendously surprised. So I've not done the study, but you can imagine that people in gated communities are even more isolated, even more separated from the rest of the world. Not only in terms of values, but also in terms of their proclivities and their behaviors toward the collective good. Well, there are some gated communities that are probably different from some others. Yeah. And I didn't notice many gates when I drove in, so I'll just be honest.
Professor?
Yeah.
Did your studies include variances between inherited wealth and, let's say, nouveau riche?
Yes.
A lot of the people that I know,
Yes.
for instance, and what did they show? I would tell you personally, I know at least a dozen people who come from working class families, are today worth over $1 million, and have had a history of community service.
Yeah, so that's very similar to what we find. So his point was about where a person, or his question, your question was about where wealth comes from, and how that, whether having inherited it versus having earned it yourself, changes or doesn't change your levels of compassion and generosity. And he was saying that he had numerous friends that have worked hard for their money and earned lots of it, and still engage in all sorts of things to better their communities. Did I get that right? Yeah. And so that's, I think, one of the interesting ironies is that if you've come from a disadvantaged background and worked for what you have, for various reasons, you feel like you know what it's like to not have, and maybe want to better your communities, but those are the kinds of patterns that we document. So if you've earned your money, you feel less entitled of it, even though you can imagine that people who have earned their money feel more deserving of it, but no, they report less entitlement, they engage in more compassion than people who have inherited their money. So it's almost like with inheritance comes a kind of defensive justification in which you create a narrative, right, that to justify it. You didn't earn it yourself. That can be a very dissonant thing for you, right? A threatening thing. So you create a narrative that says, well, I've got it because I'm special in some way. I'm unique in some way. Yeah.
Let's just take two more questions.
Two more questions, just two more questions.
No, you've already asked a question, sir, I'm sorry. There's a lot of people that haven't asked a question yet.
Yeah, I have a question. Warren Buffett and Bill Gates have started a group called the Giving Pledge, where I think there's about 150 multimillionaires and billionaires that have pledged to donate at least half of their wealth to charity. And I've read one time that people, once they reach about $10 million, then they realize that they may have enough. Do you think about something? Do you think that your survey would be different if the rich was just the super rich compared to the poor people?
Maybe. I think we don't have access. So maybe not surprisingly, the 0.0001 top 0.0001% doesn't respond to surveys for $5 an hour. So it's but we've got a lot of rich people, and we just completed a study that includes lots of millionaires. And we asked them it might be four simple questions, but let me represent them to you now. How much money do you have? They report their number. Some of these are great fortunes. How much more money do you think you would need to get all the things that you think you need to be happy? And all we do is look at the discrepancy between what people have and what they think they need to be in a state that they would be satisfied with. And then we look at that as a function of how much they have. So you might think that the more of something you have, the less of it you think you need in order to be a content and satisfied person. But you've all heard the term hedonic treadmill, right? Where like you're on this treadmill of hedonism and you're always striving for that carrot, and that carrot's always in front of you, but you're never actually reaching it. Well, the more money you have, not only is it the case that you think you need more to be happy, but you think you need far more than someone who's got even less than you do. So with rising levels of wealth comes an increasing estimation of how much more of that thing you actually feel like you need to be satisfied. I don't know about the very, 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 very top percentile, and you're talking about 150 people in the Giving Pledge, right? That's only 50% of their fortunes, right? They still have, or at least, yeah, and that's only 150 people. But at least looking at broad trends, it's hard to say that people at a certain point reach a point where they feel satiated, because money is not the same kind of resource as drinking a glass of water is, you know? Yeah.
When you talk about the study you're going to do in Qatar, I have been to Dubai this year, and I was surprised because of the wealth, as you just said, that the Sheikh Maktoum has now have somebody in his cabinet, a woman, 35 years old, and she is the Minister of Happiness. And he wrote a book about that, about happiness. So I listened to what you're saying, and yes, there is some truth. And on the other spectrum of that, when you talk about family, my daughter went to school with the family who were working from P.E. Island, whose land is where they film Anna Green Gables. So they have a lot of money. And yet, the way they brought up their two children, boy and girl, allowed her daughter to spend Thanksgiving with me. And it was very strange to see how that child, when I was shelling beans, she said, I can snap beans because my mom and dad wanted us to do things. And my brother had to shovel snow, and they didn't have to do that. So I often wonder about rich people and how they live, and the family, the values.
Yep. No, it's a great comment, and I think that's a wonderful comment to end on. So thank you so much, and thank you all.